Is there an advantage to, given that your first teacher is going to have a major impression on you, is there an advantage to having worked with an impressionist? That is to say, somebody who works with color and effects first before going into the world of art, which you might call academic drawing, or what? Which way does it work? Uh, I I was the student of an impressionist, broken color, Monet, drawing last. Is that a painting, or is that a color drawing? Was the question, uh, and I definitely see some advantages. Uh, as long as you don't lose track of the fact that you actually believe that drawing matters. And when I say drawing, I mean everything related to it, which is a far more comprehensive field than uh, just academic drawing, which is the modeling between outlines of objects. So I'm pleased to talk about these three different queries that came up. They're bearing down on me. So a couple of these are very old, and I want to go ahead and deal with them. Carol, Richard, and Gail. Carol says, please talk about color relationships, either in Degas, Monet, or in a still life setup. And so I assume that that means that she wants to talk about color relationships, that is to say, in designing a picture and setting up. I don't much think of Monet as that guy. I think of Degas much more that way. So I'm going to focus on Degas. So to whatever degree we talk about design, it'll be really focused on Degas. And I brought a bunch of images for you. Richard says, I'd be interested if you had any thoughts on these quotes. When a dealer inquired what he used to get colors of such brightness, Degas retorted, dead color, sir. And from Beeson, this is also part of the quote, a real artist is constantly looking for, searching out the places in the picture which are not brilliantly colored. The neutral colors, Tarbell calls them, the dirty colors. Without them, the rest lose their effect. And that's from Richard. Interesting sidelight in relation to that is this whole idea of the right amount of no color. That was a Robert Douglas Hunter quote, and I don't know if he got that from somebody else, but it sounds very much like a Gamilism, the right amount of no color. And then Gail says, just more recently, what is meant by chroma versus values in hue, which is really quite a big deal. And so let me just go through these pictures and hope I don't forget to talk about one of these points. As usual, I'll try to remind myself at the end and see if I've forgotten somebody completely. Um, so let's see what we got here. First thing that comes to mind, of course, is that color is always a function of design. It's always a color relationship problem. If the colors don't go together, the thing is it's unbearable, unwearable. I like to say it about clothes you might wear, the tie you're wearing with that suit, or whatever for the brooch, the scarf with that dress, etc. So. And so there's so many other interesting features. The idea of setting off, right? I like that discussion about Degas. I mean, in relation to Degas, where he says the right amount. I'm sorry, dead colors, sir, because he's flipping it, which is characteristic of Degas. He's flipping it to say, look, we're not talking about how bright your colors can get. We're talking about how you feature a color. So, and the only thing you can do, if given X, say you have the most chromatic red in your whatever on your palette or in your box of pastels in some of Degas' cases, uh, if you get that, that's only as red as you can make it. You can't make it like nature, and yet it sets off so beautifully in the environment. Then that's your job, isn't it, to set that off, if that's the significant beauty that you're after. So the setting off idea has frequently, and you'll see that with many, many, many painters, frequently means using green, rather a green note, probably a neutral, more or less neutral green, in the background of a portrait. And witness that image there on the left by Degas. And you can see, if you don't look hard at this thing, how that's a featured note, right? It's a version, it's one of the reds in this set here. The rest of this stuff being cooler and in the green to yellow family, making this, but you can just see that it features both by light and by redness, And it's arguable that this is similar in Chroma, except it doesn't. When you don't look hard at it, it barely. It's trying to compete, but it doesn't quite, does it? So, but that's the idea of setting off. So this picture is very, very neutral picture, and this color still sings, and it sings as color. Um, if you can't make that happen if you make a dead face, and then if it's truly dead, and there has to be some life in the note if you actually want it to feature. It has to have a color, and then of course the less color you have in it, if you really want it to feature the way it might sitting in front of you, the more you have to work the background and neutralize all sorts of things. So it's a similar thing here with the outdoor one. These are all indoor paintings for him. He does drawings, he paints them up. But the idea here is to feature, here again, these notes, right? And he does it again and again. This one I think is probably off a bit, but and lots. I mean, half of the featuring we get is by light. There's no question. Corot's comment that the center of interest is where the lightest light is, isn't very far from the point. I mean, certainly is one of those factors. On the other hand, and so you would argue that this isn't doing it much by color and chroma. So these are weakened. If these were bright chromas floating out in the middle of nowhere, this wouldn't work. On the other hand, there's a certain satisfaction in this combination of the brightest light and the most intense notes. Again, think of this as whether or not it's just pleasing to look at. Would you wear that, that color scheme? Interesting, if these are true in relation to each other, what a cool picture this one is, and what a warm picture this one is, so much so that the blue is sort of sticking out, where this one here, the reds are more notable. Now that's only the way this presents, and again, I've said before, I'll say it again, just go ahead and assume that we're talking about the picture we see as we see it in front of us, and we make the assumption that probably none of these shots are really, precisely what the painter set out for us. Nothing in painting prevents you from using intense colors. A lot of the Degas work comes across, the pastels, especially the dancers, really do come across as rather intense in color. And I'm talking about the overall picture. The bottom right one is an example of the picture that overall comes across as an overall brilliant color intensity. Now, that's what we're talking about, Gail, when we're talking about intensity. You could say that this is the most intense color in this picture, right? It's the richest area. And you might say it's competing between the darker one and the lighter one, and the combination is doing a lot of stuff for them. This one comes across as being the most intense in this picture. And that's a saturation, chroma, whatever. Chroma is an old word that could mean just color. It's, and in various times in your education, you'll just delight that it's used one way and you just like it as a word. And I remember hearing it as the intensity. But if you mean hue, you mean the redness, yellowness, or blueness of a color. And so here's the blue, and there's the red, there's the yellow. Those are the hues. The intensity goes with this one, right? The reds are the most intense of these colors. And you can see the way the intensity causes it to project to your eye. All other things being equal, by the way. Sure, this may come to your eye by lightness as well. So you have to learn to measure those things. See, this is pretty intense, but it's not as intense as that by some distance, by a little distance. It's not as intense as that. By the way, there's a recessiveness by I guess it's the wavelengths or whatever of the different colors, but blues tend to be more recessive. But you can do that with any of these pictures. And I'm looking at the entire group, and you'd be tending to, if you just look at the whole group without thinking about anything, you'd say this area is the most intense, and this area then is next, and some parts of these pictures here may start competing with, but I mean, take up the next, pick up next. So this is a fairly nice example of how pictures can really look rich, those really rich colors, intense saturation, intensity, saturation. These are all the things we mean by rich and by chroma. But this isn't necessarily a highly chromatic picture. I remember seeing it recently in Boston. And it's just as beautiful as this, but it isn't lit like this. This is definitely the function of a, this computer screen. But still, it has this marvelous color quality. And if you think of color the way I do, you do think color quality. I mean, Degas doesn't put down colors simply to be dead. If he does a dead color, he does it in a direction, right? So this one here tends to be more of a gold, but it's the most dead gold. He, by the way, has a love of weaving several colors in there, so you can see blues and other things in there. That's by way of getting to the deadness he wants. But you could argue that this is the same thing done more rich than this, right? The same sort of general color, which is a very odd thing to say. You have to get used to that idea. But this is a richer version of that general color. Um, let's see. So the right amount of no color, that's fairly straightforward. The idea of use of the colors that go together, but the idea of threes is also important, and that's the idea, so do use red, yellow, and blue. Think of it that way as the need to get to some level of interest to the human being, but also the level where you can get music. I kind of don't, I think it compares fairly that you can't make music out of ding dong. But if you can get to ding dong ding, you might be able to begin to start talking about that as having possibilities of getting to music, which is the requirement of rhythms and proportion and all that sort of stuff. Getting to three is like basic, and you can think of color that way if you like. It's not a bad thing. You do still think of pictures as having a general color. Like this is a more warm picture. This is a much more cool picture. This is somewhere in between, and so on. And you could argue this is a greener one. Well, this one here is purpler. And, so the hue thing, they take over the entire picture in general. These are tendencies of the picture as a generalization, which is a very important thing to learn. But the idea of colors setting off other colors, well, values are the first thing we use, the silhouette to set off, right? We use contrast and edge to set off. But, and you can see some of that happening here. So like these two things, this is values, light contrast, setting these things off. And yet your eye is here early and often, right? One of the best lights, but also the most significant chroma in the largest dose, shall we say. So yeah, what else can we say about that? Here's a good example on the right here of the neutrality of a picture in general, the right amount of no color to feature these notes. But one of the realities of this is that these kinds of notes don't have to be anywhere near as brilliant depending on the neutrality of these things. And the Impressionist mind is to set out colors before you and begin to look at them. And even a guy like Ang or Bouguereau would set out colors. They might make a little teeny tracing of their painting, and then they will set out colors blobs, looking for a color scheme. That's the academic / imaginative paint job. Well, an Impressionist, and that's what Degas is doing, by the way. And we've talked about that in other ones, so you can look at it. But when you're dealing with a slice of life, that's just going to be a little bit of a different story. So I must have some more of those coming. By the way, this is a picture that gives you a good example of how you can have nearly a two-color system. So it's blue and yellow, right? Except for that red, or that red, you know what I mean? So the reds. So there's this proportional thing. There's a dominant coolness here. The blues are the greater amount, or there's competition with the blues to the yellows, but the reds are definitely the smallest amount, and the proportion sometimes can have an effect of making it more dramatically about the center, if it's the least of that color. So one of the things you try to avoid in design is to have the most interesting colors stuck over on one side of the painting. Really not the cleverest thing to do, because it'll uniquely create interest. It's sort of like a light, like this light right up here. You pop that in for the first time only in one spot, and you're going to probably have a problem. But the fact that it's all tied to the center already, that similar effect means that the center is going to hold against that if that's in isolation. If I'd put a brilliant, brilliant red over there with that thing, the only thing that would save this red is by being bigger, right? And maybe even having more interest by way of silhouettes and just variety of, drawing the elements and that sort of thing. So I'm just talking about design now. I'm really supposed to be talking about color. You know, the two people that we have to um, go back to when it comes to design in general are I'm color design in general. Well, design in general, the one person is Jerome, right? I don't think anybody is a more schooled designer than Jerome, more thoughtful designer, uh, but I don't think most people think of him as being a color designer. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful example. First of all, of the great no colorness of the general picture. It's a gray. And it's an easy game. I think that clearly Bob Hunter believed in that as a model, as a general model. You basically want everything to be neutral so you can feature your colors. But neither of these guys does it exclusively. And if you get to Degas, you're actually in a world where do we have to live in that world exclusively? So you see there's some paintings like the one on the right bottom that just have they just live in a different intensity zone, but there's still the relative neutrality. But I'm probably making this too long, longer than it needs to be. I want you to just simply see the essence of featuring up. Now, if I'm talking to Gail, I'd be talking about which color is more intense on here. That's the more intense of these colors, right? You could argue down that this is the second most intense, and maybe that would be third, and so on, right? Or one of those. But you can see that this wouldn't be in the class of an intense color. This wouldn't be. This would definitely not be, right? Intensity. Now, again, use my word chroma if you like, or find a word that's better for you. It's one of the things about this visual world is these words, they're so loaded with stuff from our previous background, from our childhood, shall we say, that there's a better word for us. So in some ways, it's very forgiving that the arts haven't decided the vocabulary is X. I had a student once who said, and he was very, very insistent on it, that I really shouldn't use the word relationships and relational. It just annoyed him. And still to this day, I'll have to ask him someday. I see him from time to time. I'll have to ask him what he meant by that. I still don't know, and I wonder whether there was something psychological from his background. Again, featured notes. You see exactly on the right one. This is Robert Douglas Hunter, these top two. And he comes by two generations later, he comes out of this world. He does it honestly from Paxton to Gamble, and there's Hunter, right? But Paxton was a student of Jerome's and a strong student of Jerome's, and but in both cases, you see the idea of featuring is very much about is very much one of those things that don't that focuses you on the center of interest, or is a factor in creating centers of interest, and you can't ignore it. So the intensity is a big deal. And whether we talk about intensity, we mean that there's really intense colors, but we want a range of intensities all the way down to the deads, right down to the neutral. So every picture has this range, and the range is the interest in a picture is in the variety, right? So think that way, right? Don't just say this is a brilliant picture and everything is going to be brilliant. Some people do, but even in those pictures, the relative brilliance is varied if the pictures are good. Anyway, look at this very pleasant yellow background, large number of blues traveling through all, and then this featuring up of the reds, and the nice, beautiful distribution, which is the third question about the reds, right? About the colors. So this distribution, is this more intense than this? Well, when you darken a color down enough, it doesn't come across as being more intense. So there's a factor there that plays, but it's arguable this is actually the more intense note. Uh, and again, back to your word, do we mean chroma? Yeah. So between the two, this is the lighter in value, right? This one is maybe slightly the more orange, maybe slightly. They appear to be really close to being the same color. And this is the least of them all, right? There's given three, shall we say, three reds. This is the most neutral by chroma, and it's, well, valuistically, actually, it's probably a little darker than this one. So anyway, yeah, you can see these things for yourself. But understand that so, oh, and last thing I didn't want to forget to say is the idea of foil. So the neutral creates a foil to feature color, right? But so does blue or any color serve as a foil if it's more neutral than the other one. It serves as a background. So set each other off. If I go all the way back to that first, see if I can jump to it. The first, Degas. Oops, this one. If I can go back to this one, you can see how the neutralizing greens, but they serve as a foil. And that idea of foil is very interesting. But a blue picture serves as a foil in general for the reds. They tend to feature up a bit. But you'd say the same thing is true of a darker picture. The lights are featured as a foil. But think of intensity or as neutrality rather, as deadness of color, serving to feature the non-dead, just to feature the more chromatic notes. All right, I guess that's long. So, yeah, I hope I've covered it. Chroma value and hue, you have all that. Yeah, the right amount of no color. That's all great. Okay, good. Thank you all for these questions. And yeah, do subscribe and all the rest. Let your friends know about it. I was told by producer to say something about ringing a bell, but I have no idea what he's talking about. So do subscribe, share, and comment, please. All right, next time.